I'm George Liston, CA, and this is Dialogue, a weekly exploration into the worlds of international affairs, history, and culture. It's a bitter irony that after the quiet ending of the potentially catastrophic Cold War, the world is still poised on the knife's edge of massive tragedy. Ours seems to be an era of dangerous misunderstandings, in which others are seen as through a glass darkly, and the suspicion which results plays itself out in fear, hatred, and violence. It will take an enlightened and concerted effort to end the savage conflict of this new century, and it will be an effort dependent upon the success of bold new thinking in the field of conflict resolution. My guest is Dr. Abdul Aziz Saeed, Director and founder of the International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program at American University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Saeed, welcome to Dialogue.
Good to be with you, George.
It's a pleasure to have you with me, sir. Let's start out perhaps by familiarizing our audience and me as well with what we mean by conflict resolution as a discipline, as an activity. I have a suspicion that it's probably more than just saying that peace is the absence of war. How would you define it?
It is resolving conflict non-violently, creatively, with more imagination. It is transforming conflict.
Transforming conflict.
Definitely, yeah.
And then I guess
it's much more than management.
Much more than management.
Much more than management.
Yeah. And by transforming conflicts, I suppose transforming society itself.
Definitely, yeah. Transform power relationship.
Within the society.
Within society. Power relationship between conflicting groups in society. It is a whole discipline that has been developing rapidly beginning, say, with the 70s and 80s.
I would venture to say, Dr. Saeed, is a discipline the world needs. It would seem to me that in that very complex range of themes and topics you take into consideration must figure things like social justice, like human rights and so forth.
Definitely, because for too long, the discourse, be it the intellectual discourse or the political discourse on war, has separated justice from security. And by separating justice from security, we have rendered peace merely to absence of violence, and justice merely to absence of gross violations of human rights. Right. So part of what we try to do in the conflict resolution programs, nationally, internationally, is to reconnect security to justice. There cannot be peace without justice.
It would seem to me that what you're talking about is a peace that is deeply rooted, and therefore the one that would endure rather than just a truce or a cessation of hostility.
Definitely. I mean, we are reconceptualizing peace.
Right.
Peace is a presence of justice. Peace is ecological balance. Peace is human security. Peace is providing for cultural pluralism.
Right.
Peace is providing for political coexistence. Definitely, yeah.
We're going to talk about all of those things, cultural pluralism in particular. But I can't resist saying, Dr. Saeed, as we both know, that in the American mind right now, issues of war and peace revolve pretty much around the Middle East.
Yes. And
the issue of terrorism. One way of talking about it might be this. As we both know, there's a book that's making a tremendous splash right now called Imperial Hubris. It's by an anonymous CIA.
Yes, I have.
You've probably read it.
Yes, yeah.
I had not read the whole book, but I do understand this much, that one of its principal theses is this, that we've tended to look at the whole issue of terrorism too simplistically.
True.
And I believe the author, the anonymous author, makes the point that the opposition that we're facing is not because of the values we espouse here, but rather the policies we enact abroad. I want to get your sense of that sentiment and your other thoughts about how we put terrorism in context if we're going to overcome it.
For me, one way of looking at terrorism is to learn a lesson that I have learned from looking at drugs. And I did some research on drugs back in the 70s. In dealing with drugs, we focused primarily on responding to the supply side of drugs, drug dealers, but not on the demand side of drugs, those who are using the drugs. By doing that, we have not dealt with the issue of drugs. In fact, in the United States at this time, we spend more than $70 billion on dealing with the so-called war on drugs that we had declared back in the early 70s.
That's right.
So the war on terrorism, like the war on drugs, probably is going to be a war without end, because if we look at the supply side of terrorism and the demand side, by supply side I'm referring to the dealers,
Right.
those who purvey the violence, the Bin Ladens and the others. On the other hand, the demand side, those who are caught in it and are recruited.
Right.
Now, the supply side of it is easy to understand, hard to deal with. The demand side is hard to understand, but easy to deal with. So what we have chosen to do is deal with the supply side of drugs, which is easy, but not the demand side, which is
More
much
difficult.
More
Well,
difficult.
now if we, and then...
And by that I mean injustices and many other things.
This is important. What you're saying is if we attend to the demand side, we're going to have to wrestle with some really difficult, long-standing
You
problems.
bet, yeah.
Problems of what? Social inequity?
Exactly.
The lack of justice?
Authoritarian systems in those societies, injustices. Hey, it has to do with other societies. We are paying the price here too in the United States.
Right.
So those of us who are calling for a response to the demand side, we are not saying that we should not deal with the supply side, we ought to.
But you're
But
saying-
we have to deal with the demand side.
Because as a response to the supply side, so to speak, would be simply, for example, a military response.
Exactly, yeah.
And you're saying that may have its place,
Exactly,
but there is
definitely.
much, much more to be done.
Definitely, much more. And that is more complicated.
Right.
And that's why we are not dealing with it anyway.
Well, one of the interesting things listening to you is that because what you suggest to me, all the things that you're talking about in that other more complex range of topics are tremendously political.
Definitely. Yeah.
And we're not hearing anything about it. I'll make a comment on this political election so far. You're talking about the need for a sort of a national political debate, I would think, in this
Definitely,
country.
we need to do that, yes. And the lesson that I have learned way back in the 70s, at that time, did my research on drugs.
Right.
And discovered the lesson then that we are not in a better place nationally when it comes to the war on drugs.
Right. After 30 years.
My concern, we may be in the same place 10, 20, 30 years from today if our focus is going to be totally concerned with the supply side.
And if we are in the same place 30 years from now, it's going to be at a horrendous human cost.
Definitely,
We would both agree on
definitely.
that. How important to all of this, Dr. Said, and that you pay particular attention to these issues in the Middle East, so how important is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the eyes of all concerned?
Important. In the Middle East, very important. And for me personally, as someone who has been working with that issue for many, many years, there are solutions. And the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is there's a solution that is both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli.
Right.
The pro-Israeli part of the solution is total, complete security guarantees involving the quartet, meaning the United States, Europeans, Russia, and the United Nations, as well as the Arabs. We ought to also get those guarantees from the Arabs themselves under the auspices of the quartet.
So that all parties would feel no longer under the threat of attack
Exactly.
from any party.
So that is security for Israel.
Okay.
For the Palestinians, a Palestinian state.
A-
And a Palestinian state.
A fully sovereign.
A fully sovereign
sovereign
Palestinian
separate
state. Yeah.
And if the world and the West and the United States in particular were to pursue both of these themes simultaneously and energetically, you think we could come to a better place?
Definitely. I mean, for me, I really see a solution that is both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. But what has not happened, we have learned in conflict resolution, when there's a conflict between two parties who suffer from a great disparity in power,
Right.
as the Israelis and the Palestinians are, the third party, in this case the United States, usually, as we have done in Bosnia, takes the side of the weaker of the two to rectify the balance. But we can't do it with Israel for many other considerations. So what is happening in the conflict, there's a tremendous disparity in power between the conflicting parties.
This is a very interesting point. I don't think very many people have brought it forth. In light of that, And because we have a special relationship with Israel, which will certainly continue, how does the United States then act as the honest broker? How does it speak more emphatically on the side of the weak in this situation? What could it do to, I guess, in a sense, bolster its credentials with the Palestinians?
By involving, as the U.S. has been trying to do, but not recently a great deal, the quartet, other powers, Europeans, United Nations, and definitely by also influencing the Arabs. The Arabs have on the table the Saudi proposal for peace with Israel, which is a proposal that has a great deal of merit to it. A proposal that in return for peace, all the Arabs would recognize the state of Israel. This would be total peace, total diplomatic exchange. That should be refined. I'm not saying it's completely refined, but certainly what I have learned, George, from working with peace and conflict resolution, peace occurs only when the leaders are willing to pay the price. War continues when the people are called upon to pay the price. So this is where leadership has to come. This is where the leaders have to pay the price, whether it's us in Washington, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Damascus, Baghdad, New York.
Right.
That's what we have learned.
You have written some very interesting things about leadership as a phenomenon, which I want to turn to, and you just reminded me of them with that fine observation. I also want to turn, and I'll do it right now, to leadership in Iraq, because you have spent a great deal of your time offering the consultation, I guess we would call it, the very highest levels of the State Department, the UN, and other august bodies. And you have, I do believe, Dr. Saeed, personal knowledge and friendship with some of the people who are currently running affairs in this new phase of the Iraqi situation. So I guess that's the first question. What is your sense of confidence in the situation there as it exists right now, the so-called new government with its sovereignty? I guess the question is very blunt. Can they achieve stability, peace, and so forth?
Definitely. I mean, what we see in Iraq now, what appears to be happening in Iraq, in a way, people ask me the question, have we failed? Has Washington failed? I would say to the extent we have failed, if we have failed, it's death by bureaucracy, it's death by lack of vision, it's death by competing agendas. Having said all of that, what we see in Iraq is a positive development. Historically, Iraq and Arab countries have had the misfortune of leaders who disempower them. Leadership by disempowerment.
Right. Leaders who repress them.
Leaders who repress them, disempower them, steal their power away, steal their riches away. What is hopefully happening is a leadership that empowers people. A leadership occurs when there's an agreement between leader and follower on where to go.
Now, I agree with you completely, and I think you might agree with me also that for that leadership to have the effect we would both want, security has to be established. I mean, it's almost dramatically late.
The two are completely connected because what we see in Iraq, the insecurity we see in Iraq, security, George, is a function of legitimacy. Yeah. If there is no legitimacy, there cannot be security. Meaning, the people to feel that the system is a legitimate system, that there's a fair distribution of benefit and cost.
Right.
As long as there is a lack of legitimacy, we cannot expect security. So the sooner that legitimacy occurs, the sooner the Iraqis can be empowered, then definitely it will happen.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Led by your thought, I kept thinking as you spoke that to get that legitimacy, this government has to get the fullest definition of sovereignty as quickly as possible. I would think you would.
They have to, no question about that. They have to, and you asked about, I have worked with a number of Iraqis who are in a position of power. I served as an advisor to the Democratic Principles Working Group of the Department of State in 2002, 2003 that resulted in making recommendations for the Future of Iraq project. These are women and men capable. They are committed. They are savvy. But definitely what they are dealing with is huge.
Exactly.
It is huge.
I have to thank you because you give us a sense of hope and hard work.
Definitely.
Together.
I'm very hopeful. And in my work, those of us in peace work and conflict resolution suffer from a genetic defect. We are optimists. We have to be optimists.
I'm going to ask you about that too, because I'm impressed by it. I must say, it's contagious.
It's
to be around you.
contagious, yeah.
Well, let me talk about that right now in a sense. How would you define this era? When I introduced our conversation, I went in some very somber language about the end of the Cold War and the resultant tragedies. But how did you think this is well, it's obviously a difficult time. Is it a transitional time as well?
It really is, George. My training is in international relations. For the last this is my 47th year as an academic at American University. Looking at what has happened with the end of the Cold War, for us Americans, the end of the Cold War deprived us from a compass by which we direct our foreign policy. We had a compass before. It was the Soviet Union. It was communism. The compass is gone. Number two, it deprives us as American citizens from a framework by which we judge the wisdom or lack of wisdom of our foreign policy. So we need a national debate. We need to look at how do we judge? What are our goals?
And I would think, sir, you would say if we have that debate, we will want to turn, not just the United States, but the whole world, to transform societies. A lot of your work seems to be on transforming the present state of things into a better state worldwide, which brings us to pluralistic societies and notions that transcend the nation state. This is very exciting thinking. How do you get to it?
You know, my work, my lessons, my experience with pluralism has nothing to do with books. Back in 1957, as a beginning academic, students on my campus at American University wanted to set up a fraternity on campus. And when I asked them, why do they want to set up a fraternity? We have 4 fraternities. They told me that the fraternities on our campus have sectarian clauses, like all national fraternities. You can't join if you are Jewish, you can't join if you are Catholic, you can't join if you are African, etc. So what we did on campus, we then tried, a number of us, tried to change that. And indeed, we established Phi Epsilon Pi, a national Jewish fraternity, back in 1957-58. Now, that Phi Epsilon Pi, national Jewish fraternity, which is now ZBT, admitted the Jewish students who were the scholars, had the high GPAs, admitted the African students who were the athletes, admitted the international students who had all the money. So in 5 years, we became the fraternity on campus. We became it on campus. I mean, and when you visit American University now, you see buildings named after members of that fraternity, which is cultural diversity, cultural pluralism. Well, it enriched everyone.
Well, this is exciting because it also suggests a hunger among young people for this kind of experience. And I think your very work in conflict resolution and peace studies grows out of student enthusiasm at American University.
Well, definitely. They created their program. Literally, they did, because way back in the 60s, they started looking for alternative ways of looking at politics, at diplomacy, and they started meeting. And we started having meetings, students and faculty members, through the 70s. And by the 80s, it emerged.
This is good, because these are the young people who pay the price of war if peace is not made. You must be concerned with, in those studies, as you have been in your writings, with what we might call the new global citizen, the kind of person who's going to inherit a world in which we get a much higher degree of pluralism in place. Briefly said, what would be the qualities of such a global citizen? What would he or she look like?
See, first let's look at the context. Today, July 11th, is it? Or
July 12th.
12th. Our planet has never been simultaneously closer than it is today and more apart.
True.
And our planet has never been simultaneously richer and poorer. Let's face it, that's the context. So the global citizen is someone who has to combine intuitive consciousness, rational consciousness, someone who has to have a global education that learns from various cultures. For example, what we are learning in conflict resolution, when we look at the 20th century, it was a century of total war.
Yes, it was.
One of the many reasons is because we have our concept of peace historically has been fragmented. We have not had a total concept of peace. Our concept of peace throughout history has been defined by the dominant culture, imposed by the dominant military power. So when you talk about the global citizen is someone who begins to appreciate that the concept of peace has to be derived from the richness of human cultures. It cannot be just from one culture. It can, as long as it is from one culture, we will continue to live in a situation of what?
This is a universal person.
Because for me personally, George, the whole world needs the whole world. Historically, nations have met as rivals, East exploiting West, North, South exploiting one another. For me, the global citizen, the new context, is where North goes South, East goes West, exchanging the North and the East will give the best they have for one another, meaning we Americans will give the rest of the world the best we have in exchange of getting from them the best they have.
Right.
You talk about dialogue, your program is dialogue. It has to be dialogue of the spirit, dialogue of ideas, dialogue of many other things.
I must say the prospect is very exciting. There's I'm sure you know his work as well, George Steiner is a wonderful intellectual who characterized the 20th century as, quote, the collapse of humaneness, in which things just got so bitterly savage. And I think what you're talking about is a world in which it's essentially a family. Humanity seeing itself and its cultures as participant in the fullest sense.
Definitely, going back to the question of the global citizen is someone who has to help us reconcile in this globalization between the local, on the one hand, and the universal effects of globalization.
Right.
We have to do that reconciliation.
You know, one of the things that I find most exciting also about the work that you do is that I think everyone is getting a sense of how inclusive it is of so many traditions. It does not neglect the religious aspect of human existence. And I think you devote a great deal of time to the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And I guess much could be said about that, but to put one question to you on it, do you think in the truest interpretation of these faiths, not the exploitation, but the interpretation, there is the basis for moving toward the kind of reality you're talking about?
Definitely. I mean, for me, there are two religions on the planet. They cut across all religions.
Two religions.
We'll call them two, whatever. One I call the open, the other one the closed. The closed one are those who privilege form, which is important, rituals, they are important, and stay with that. The open religion, like the persons who adhere to the closed religion, they honor form, they honor ritual, but they understand that form and ritual are for us to use and to master so we can enter the essence. And the essence is all one.
Right.
The essence is one.
These open religions or the open interpretation of faith.
That's what I mean, open interpretation.
I can understand it very well because it seems to me it's projected forward. It calls for an action beyond itself and beyond mere ceremony.
I mean, for me, you scratch a Jew, you get a Christian. You scratch a Christian, you get a Muslim. You scratch a Muslim, get a Buddhist, a Hindu. Provided we do the scratching very gently.
I think I want to live in your world very, very much. And, you know, and maybe this thought as well, because talking about society in this way and trying to overcome problems in this, I mentioned at the outset, bold new thinking, bold new vision. You have to have bold new leaders, too. And I think also in your writings I've seen references in the 99 Names of God to Islamic conceptions of leadership,
sure.
where the leader serves God and community.
Exactly.
Is that correct?
Definitely, and the leader has to balance all of these qualities. Otherwise, she or he is not a leader. Mm-hmm. The reverse has happened in the Middle East. What we have in the Middle East are leaders who disempower their people.
Right.
who take power away from their people rather than empower them. And when you look at the 99 names in the Holy Book of Islam, in the Quran, the 99 names refer to the 99 qualities, divine qualities. And when you combine them, what you see is a beautiful model of leadership, a balancing of qualities.
And it should be our work to emulate those qualities.
Exactly, yeah.
And
I
that-
mean, the reason I say that, George, because when I served with the Iraqis last 2 years, many of the Iraqi participants kept saying, we want a strong leader. And the more they spoke about the strong leader they want, the more he looked like Saddam Hussein. I said, no, please, you don't need that guy. Because power Ken Boulding, a peace researcher, scholar, has done great works on peace and conflict resolution, talks about the many faces of power,
Right.
many images of power. There is destructive power, meaning the power of the stick. There is productive power, the power of economics. And there is integrative power, the power of love.
And this is the strongest of all.
That's
I
the
would
strongest
think.
of all, yeah.
You know, you said at the outset how what you do depends upon optimism, and we have just a few seconds left, but I cannot resist, as I said earlier, the temptation to ask you, what's the wellspring of that optimism? Where do you get it from? And if you had to put it in just a few words, what is it that gives you hope?
I mean, personally, from my experience, as a child, raised in an environment where there was total violence, bloodshed, war, revolutions. As a child, I saw that bombs dropping by in World War II. But then, gradually tapping my inner resources, having had the good fortune of being with women and men who alerted me that every one of us is God in the making.
And that's where it came from.
That's where it came from.
And you've given it to us. Thank you so much, Dr. Saeed. I look forward to many more conversations with
Pleasure
you.
being with you. Thank you.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wwic.si.edu. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching, and please join us again right here next week.